Hello, everybody. I'm Daniel Foor. It's Friday, August 21st, 2020, and I'm here with colleague and student and friend, Siobhan Siv Watkins. Dr. Watkins is a microbiologist and, as she would say, reluctant entrepreneur and ritualist, and the founder of Microanimism, which is at microanimism.com. And that is a platform for examining and developing how human beings can consciously relate to and engage with microbial organisms. And Shiv is knowledgeable about a lot of things as a doctor of microbiology. And I wanted to bring her back on the show, which isn't really a show, but just interviews, and talk about the pandemic and about animism and about the warranted attention that the very small kin are receiving these days, and how to apply more relational understandings to things like surviving and thinking clearly and moving respectfully through pandemic times. So with that, welcome. It's good to have you here, Shiv. Hi.
Hey, how's it going? It's good to be back on the Daniel Foor show.
Good. I should give an acknowledgement to our respective peoples. We both have a lot of people from England, and I think in your case also Ireland and Scotland, and much more recently the UK. And I am also of German settler-colonialist ancestries, and live now in North Carolina, Western North Carolina, traditional Cherokee lands. And I know that you're in New Mexico, in, is it Albuquerque area?
Yeah, I'm on the outskirts of Albuquerque.
Yeah, so traditional Pueblo lands, I believe. And so respect to the complex histories we're embedded in here in North America. And anything else you want to say by way of your own background before we dive into some conversation?
No, I think that covers it. I have done quite a lot of work with viruses specifically, although not the ones that kind of eat humans. I've done a lot of work with viruses that eat bacteria. So just in terms of framing it for speaking about SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19, I'm semi-competent.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, I believe you. And I know you as someone who isn't going to say something if you don't know what you're talking about. So I'm currently guiding a few online courses now, and I invited folks in the Practical Animism course and in the Kindling the Need Fire course, which is a response and a ritual way of navigating through the pandemic, invited them to submit some questions. And so, as you know, we'll be referencing some of those, and they have to do with science and different kinds of views that are different than science, and also animism and all kinds of stuff. So I will just dive in with some of those questions, and we can let it unfold from there. And the opening is, if you could riff a little on how viruses occupy, at least in the modern science categories, a liminal space between alive things and not alive things. And yeah, what would you say about the type of relative who is garnering so much attention these days?
Yeah, it's a good space to be in, right? How cool. And this is like an ongoing argument with scientists generally as to whether or not viruses are technically alive, because scientists do this. I mean, human scientists in particular do this really cute thing where they compartmentalize everything and put everything in boxes. And so there's a list of things that you need to be able to do to count as alive. So I'm alive, and my cat is alive, but a rock is not alive. Viruses, biologically speaking, are not entirely classifiable as being alive, because they can't do anything on their own. They're obligate cellular parasites. They need a host cell so that they can hijack the biochemistry of the cell to make baby viruses, basically. They're not motile. They don't crawl across the ground chasing after you. They don't excrete. They don't drink water. They don't do anything like that. They're essentially just scraps of nucleic acid and protein. But what they do, and I'll just gesture vaguely around as evidence, is have a major impact on every other living thing. So everything has a virus that infects it. Blue whales, plants, fungi, other viruses have viruses that infect them. So the kind of grown-up biological argument is that they absolutely deserve a place on the tree of life just by virtue of the fact that they drive so much diversity, and one of the ways that they drive diversity is through death. It's kind of unavoidable.
Cool. Alive or not, I believe that they especially have the world's attention. So for the next question that comes in is for people, for people who, there it is anything about the science of the virus? Of course it's evolving and changing, but August 21st, 2020, is there anything that to you is especially standing out as a new recent layer of understanding, as something surprising or something emergent about the science that's really striking?
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning here that one of the reasons why people have been so upset and so confused is that what we've seen is really an unprecedented example of the scientific method happening way faster than it usually would, and in real time. So at the beginning, I think, for example, the message was don't worry about a mask, and now it's everyone should wear masks, and that's because science is self-correcting, right? That's like 99% of being a research scientist is stuff not working and things going wrong, and then something happens and it informs everything else that you've been doing. So that's what we've been seeing, and I think it sometimes gets translated as nobody knows what they're doing, which is also true, right? But it's deeper than that. This is how science works. In terms of surprises, I mean, we're getting better at treating it and we're understanding more about it, and that's a byproduct of the huge amounts of research that are being done and the fact that there are so many people infected. What's surprising now compared to at the start of this pandemic is this disease is just so strange. The things that it does and the ways that it interacts with the human immune system and human physiology is it's just really odd. It's really surprised scientists, it's really surprised doctors, and that might be a feature of the fact that there are so many people infected that we're seeing all of these unusual side effects. But more and more it just seems like this one is just odd.
As a totally lay person for microbiology, for medicine, it seems like the symptom presentation is really varied. And not to mention the fact that some people are completely asymptomatic, and also that I don't know how unusual it is, but it's striking to me that a lot of the worst impacts on humans are the body's impact on itself after the virus has moved on or done. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the things that doctors began to notice was this sort of maladaptive immune response. So the progression of the disease is, generally speaking, the first week you feel kind of crummy, and then in the second week, if you're going to tank, that's when you're going to do it. But by that second week, levels of viruses are dropping in the body. So it really is the response of that immune response, the maladaptive immune response, that people began to notice, which led to the use of steroids and tocilizumab and things like that. But then as we've progressed on top of that maladaptive immune response, you see the issues, the pulmonary issues and inflammation and a whole bunch of other weird stuff, the way it affects children, etc., etc. So yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah, I've heard at times that being really quite healthy and having a robust immune response can in certain ways work against you because of if the cytokine storm or whatever exactly that is triggered, that the impact of the body on itself, so to speak, can actually be stronger than if you had a medium-sized immune response. And it just causes me to come back to this conclusion that I don't want to get it.
No, that's still the best advice. Like, earlier on in the beginning, I had a lot of people contacting me and saying, so I'm this age and I do this stuff and this is how I eat and I work out and la 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 la. How likely do you think I am to die from it? And, the only way you can guarantee not from dying it is not to catch it. And in terms of clustering those symptoms, and I know there's been a lot of stuff about, if you have fever but you don't have this and you do have this, you're less likely to have a bad outcome, blah, 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 blah. It's just simply all bets are off at the moment. That's the kind of research that's going to come 5, 10, 15 years in the future when we have time to sit down and take a breath about it. But for now, like, nobody knows, and it's really dangerous and unhelpful, I think, to say things like children recover fully from it, because that's not true. Maybe fewer of them die, but it doesn't mean that they recover fully from it. And again, this whole putting numbers on death rates and things like that, I might not die from it, but I really don't relish the prospect of living the rest of my life with 50% lung function. I like walking up big mountains and riding my horse, and
for sure,
it has a massive impact.
Yeah. Somebody asked about the science suggesting that I would say observing that some who recover have persistent or permanent after effects. And then they go on to ask, is this a new form of super effective virus, or do they have a view on killing their hosts, something like that? So I trust you to interface with that second part of the question, but could you start maybe just by underscoring about the way that death rates alone are misleading around impact?
There's lots of ways that death rates can be misleading. Like one of the biggest ones where, probably a couple of months ago, was people who were looking at death rates, infection rates nationally. But after New York started to settle down, what we weren't seeing was one great big national outbreak. We were seeing lots and lots and lots of different outbreaks all around the country. So, if you talk about statistics, the way that you process this information can be misleading. And that's before you even start talking about the way the media portrays it, the political use of all of this stuff, and all this kind of thing. But what I want to speak to is this idea of the virus becoming more effective, or I keep hearing over and over again the idea that the virus has mutated into a more lethal or more transmissible kind of agent. This virus is already really, really good at being a virus. Like, the only thing that is going to put enough pressure on a virus to mutate into a different functional agent is necessity, right? And really, there's no impetus for this virus to become better. It's really, really transmissible, and it doesn't kill everybody. So that's like, you've hit the jackpot if you're a virus. And for what it's worth, there is no evidence scientifically that there is a different functional form of this virus, that it's become more virulent, that it's become more transmissible, that it's done anything other than just mutate in a very, very small way, which is what all viruses do generally, because viruses mutate.
Thanks. Somebody else.
There was a second part to that, right? About there was a second animism-y flavored.
Do they have a view on killing their hosts?
Oh, okay. Do you want to address that now, or wait until we talk about it during the animism?
Why don't we wait, because that gets into how much do we relate with the virus as having agency or being human-like and things like that. Somebody asked a very practical question about how to attend a workshop safely. They want to do a multiple day thing with the shaman person. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of practical levels, but I think it goes something like, besides all the practical stuff, are there things beyond that?
Yeah, for sure. At the moment, I think there's really general human thing, like a sense of hopelessness that's really, really hard to completely eliminate. And I get that. The one thing that everybody can still do, which is something that I've just been clinging on to, is you can make personal decisions that have an impact, right? So wash your hands, wear a mask, don't lick elevator buttons. Those are probably, you know, all of this advice, those are the best things that you can do. In terms of attending a workshop, it depends on the nature of the workshop, I guess, but don't hug anybody, like all of that kind of thing. And then there's this idea of, if you're already engaged in a spiritual practice and you already have allies and you already have some form of protection, it's fine to tap into that too. What's not a great idea is to assume that because you're engaging in some kind of spiritual pursuit or activity that you're automatically protected, that there's a kind of privilege there that means the laws of physics and biology no longer apply. So I think my best response and my most mediated response to that is personal responsibility regarding the science, I think.
Yeah, that there's no shortcuts. That's been our way of holding it as a family, and we're more conservative than most people around us, even some friends at times. And it's a point of sadness in moments to see family and be like, yep, stay on that side of the porch, and to assume that people we know could be actively infected and favor keeping distance, things like that. So
yeah, I think the reality of it is that at the moment, especially in the US, you just got to kind of assume that everybody is infected in terms of how you conduct yourself outside of the family home. And it's really difficult. It's super difficult. For the whole time, I've had to travel a lot, because if I don't travel, I don't work. And if I don't work, I can't feed my animals and I can't pay my rent. So it's not great that there hasn't been leadership, because I feel like if there had been leadership around this, we'd be way out the other end of it by now. But in the meantime, everybody has to make the decisions that they feel good with, I think.
yeah, indeed. The moment that we're living in, I imagine, is particularly intense in a certain way, especially as a microbiologist or as a scientist more generally. And I wonder, despite all the polarization and people like scientists are heroes, or I mean terrible, or I mean part of the establishment, or, you know, all the different staticky things, for better, for worse, could you share a few good words for others who are already in or considering heading into the, I suppose, more physical sciences, about how you feel like you're able to be really authentic within that, or whatever's on your heart to say about it?
Yeah, I've been a scientist formally, one way or another, for almost 19 years now. I'm a black belt in science, and it's always been difficult. It was much easier when I was younger, and everybody expects you to act out when you're younger and question authority when you're younger. But I just kind of kept a hold of it. And it's not the path of least resistance. It never is. And it's something that I've noticed throughout all stages of my career, that there's a lot of conflict with other people too. So when I was a professor, I spoke to an awful lot of students who had Catholic faith or some kind of belief that really troubled them because they felt like it was in direct conflict with being a scientist, right? And I think that academically and maybe even socially, a lot of people are trained that if you're a scientist, ultimately you can't be anything else. Like, you can't be religious, you can't have spiritual ideals, you can't be a musician, you can't be an artist, you have to work 100 hours a week on doing this, and you can't dedicate your time to anything else. And if you don't end up as a professor, then it's a disaster. And it's not true. And the most fulfilling aspects of my career and my life as a human being have always come at the intersection of being a scientist and something else. Because being a scientist is not a calling, it's not like a family, it's a job, man. Like, it's a job, and you get to be a human being at the same time. And science is brilliant. Like, everybody is born a scientist, and it just kind of gets trained out of you as you go along. But now more than ever, what we need are more scientists. And it doesn't mean that they have to be experts, that they all have to be professors, that they all have to have a job title with the word science in it. Citizen scientists, people who garden, people who do permaculture, like people who make compost teas when they're growing marijuana. You're all scientists, and it's really important because that's what brings diversity in, difference of opinion, and more discovery. So science is always 100% worth pursuing. And a good friend of mine is a surgeon at the local hospital. And I think one of the messages that we'd both put across at this point is it's shit for everybody at the moment. Whether you're a scientist, like if you're a rep for big pharma, if you're a surgeon, if you're a doctor, if you're a nurse, all of these people that there's like all of this conflict around, whether they're the good guys or the bad guys, crappy for everyone. Like, nobody's having a good time at the moment. It's a noble pursuit to be a leader that not everybody likes, I think.
Thanks. Yeah. On the topic of so many people having a hard time, not to put you in the position of having to prophesize about where we're headed, but I feel curious, based on a more informed read of what's actually happening in the present, if you could share a little of your best guess, knowing that it's just a guess, on some of the trajectories, maybe, I suppose, just here in the United States. I believe there's about 170,000 people maybe who have died so far, and maybe 4 million, I think, or more confirmed positive cases, which may be a magnitude of, I don't know, 8 to 12 more times that, probably actually positive. But where there's a lot of hope around a vaccine becoming available quickly and all that. But what's the next year look like to you?
This would be much easier to speculate on if all we had to worry about was the science of it, right?
Indeed. There's no political complexity here, fortunately, but
There's no nuance to this situation whatsoever. It's just bananas. But my really honest answer, without, being too British about it, is the next year doesn't look good. My concern with the vaccine, and I'll preface this by saying I 100% believe in vaccines. And if you ask me, I will tell you, get a flu vaccine, get your kids vaccinated, take that as you will. My concern with the vaccine, the worst possible thing that could happen is that we rush it and it's not effective, or we rush it and something bad happens. There is a reason why it takes so long to develop vaccines.
One of the bad things happening being the deepening public mistrust in vaccines.
Absolutely. Yeah. A vaccine, whether it shows up next year or tomorrow, is useless if 70% of the population refuses to take it. And this is bearing in mind as well, is that I think think Fauci said that if we had a vaccine that was 75% effective, he'd be happy with that. It's important to remember that no vaccine is 100% effective. So I think a vaccine by the end of this year, even if we did have one, there are so many issues with production, public reception to that. I think we're definitely in this for the long haul until the end of next year in the US. And, you know, that's looking at, that's framing it in the place that we are now, politically, socially, all that kind of stuff as well. I think.
Is there? Yeah, go ahead.
I think, you know, the other kind of plan B that people talk about a lot is, oh, well, you know, at least it's burning through the population and so we'll get herd immunity that way. And unfortunately, that's not happening either. I think seroprevalence in New York City at the moment is 20%. So that's 20% of people who have some kind of natural immunity to the virus. We need around 70% to get herd immunity. This coronavirus is 100% following the other coronaviruses that we know about, which is that if you catch it, there's no durable immune response. So a vaccine is our best bet of going back to the before days, because nothing will ever be normal again after this, I don't think.
Keeping it grim, winter is coming here in the north, and could you speak to what we currently might predict in terms of impact of seasonal change? There was a lot of false and unrealized hope about summer being helpful, and yet winter is coming now. So how's that?
It's not good. It's so the reason why a lot of diseases peak in the winter is not because any viruses or bacteria have an affinity for cold weather. It's because people tend to be inside more. They tend to be in larger groups inside more, and that's why you get huge uptick in things like seasonal flu and the norovirus, the winter vomiting bug, which is just delightful. And that's going to be true of COVID as well. The real scary thing is this idea of co-infections. If you catch the flu, which is, regardless of what anybody might have heard, a pretty gnarly thing to catch, and then you catch COVID-19 on top of it, that's not good news. Even, you know, if we go back to nursing homes, norovirus can be a real big problem in nursing homes. And norovirus can kill the elderly or the very young quite easily. And you throw COVID-19 into the mix there as well. These dynamics, we don't really know what's going to happen or what it's going to look like, but it's not going to be good. So yeah, people should start planning accordingly for that.
Let's pivot to questions that are perhaps less tethered to what we might consider science. Lighten the mood a little with some other kinds of inquiries.
We can try and lighten the mood.
So the question comes in, some folks I generally respect are saying things that viruses don't really exist and they've never been proven as real. Did you weigh in on that?
I'm just going to pour myself another gin.
Yeah, that's welcome. Yeah, it's
purely for spiritual purposes. Well, now, nobody's ever proved that I exist either. And why would they? So, you know, I can be really squirrely about this and say science is great because it never actually proves that anything is true. It just proves a lot of things that aren't true. Null hypotheses for the win and all that kind of thing. But, you know, if I'm being really honest about it, I just don't understand that perspective and that point of view, which is okay. I don't need to understand it. It's like, whatever. Well,
it's like whatever until people act as if that is the more accurate map of the world. And then in doing so, endanger or kill in avoidable ways others by
That's,
virtue of their lack of consideration of the reality of viruses.
yeah, totally. That's the problem. And I 100% throw down with anybody who wants to try and say that. Like, it would be beautiful. But this goes back to the idea of personal responsibility, and, you know, taking that stuff on board. I mean, I find it very difficult to relate to this, partly because I find it difficult to relate to humans anyway, but also I've seen viruses, I've seen them infect cells, I've seen them replicate inside cells. That information is freely available in Technicolor to anybody who wants to go looking for it. So I can't grasp the validity of that perspective and point of view in any way. And I know there are also PhDs and MDs who say lots of strange things that are in conflict with scientific opinion, and it's okay to speak against that kind of stuff. But again, yeah, I can't sympathize.
Putting on my therapist hat for a minute, there's a tendency for a lot of folks, especially who are authority averse, to want to create a false equivalency between two perspectives as a presumed stance of open-mindedness or generosity. And I understand the impulse in the sense of like, oh, you know, it's Israel and Palestine, it must just be kind of neutral. I'm like, no, like, learn the history. It is not just neutral. I mean, not to take it in that direction so much, but some situations are not very symmetrical.
No, and I completely get that as well. It's like, you know, look at me. Like, I don't look like a scientist. I've never behaved like a scientist. There are lots of people that I've really, really pissed off, and it's fine. But it's just, yeah, it's really, really hard. And like you say, it can be really, really dangerous. And again, this is why we need more people to educate themselves in the hard sciences so that they can find that space between the ineffable and the effable.
Yeah. Well, I mean, can you speak? There's another question to the view that wearing a mask is bad for you, and that there's a lot of folks who have taken on that perspective, which, again, people can do what they're going to do, and yet we impact one another. So then it's really understandable to have feelings about that. I mean, we go out for walks sometimes, and we don't wear a mask when we're walking on a trail, but we give people distance. And outside, giving distance, not shouting or coughing in people's face, seems okay from what I can understand. And
that's just polite generally, isn't it?
Indeed. And yet there's folks here who are just like, want to get right up in our kids' face and be like, oh, hi, how you doing? You're so cute, without a mask. And I'm like, get away, you death breathing person, even though you may not intend to be doing that. So I can understand having strong feelings about it, but can you speak to that as a scientist? Are masks bad for you?
Have you considered training her to growl?
Right.
It's always worked for me. No, masks aren't bad for you. I think since the beginning of the pandemic, I felt kind of useless. Like, I have a very specific group of skills, and sometimes I can figure out the way to use them. So I've tried to translate a lot of the science in ways that a layperson can get their head around. And it's not because I'm smarter than anybody else, it's because I've been trained in this for nearly 20 years. So that's what I did. And I was probably naively quite surprised at some of the vitriolic responses that I got. And I think in times like this, and generally, people don't necessarily form opinions based on facts. They form opinions based on the way they feel, which is a really human thing, and it's charming and all that kind of thing. But, you know, once you get over that, you really have to form your own personal framework for figuring out if what you're reading on Facebook and seeing on YouTube and even hearing from the mainstream media, is it factual? Like, who benefits from telling you that? And does it make sense? Like, does it even make sense? Like, common sense is such a really useful tool to use. Masks don't hurt you. Like, they don't. And it's fine if you wear a bandana. It's fine if you wear one of those weird stretchy, I don't know what they're called. Like, every week there's all of this new information, like, you're doing this wrong, or you're killing your neighbor by not wearing a mask, or all of this kind of thing. And people are so confused and they're really hurting. And it's much easier to blame Bill Gates or a 5G tower than kind of get your head around the fact that sometimes crappy stuff happens and you have to respond appropriately.
Yeah, so you took care of the next 5G question, and the last one on that stack is about companies harvesting DNA for the purposes of control. And I don't mean to be like snarky or arrogant or dismissive of concerns, but it relates in the pandemic, because things like contact tracing, which from what I understand, if applied well, can actually be quite helpful in containing the spread of a thing. And yet it requires, under most systems, I think, opting in, or it being required, which is something, at least in the United States, people would have a very hard time with culturally, let's say. And so I'm like, wow, all right, our kid is not going to be going to school anytime soon because Americans don't play well together. And yeah, what's the question in there? Any final words you want to say on all the alternative science?
Oh man, I'm getting like, I'll start ending up putting my anti-capitalist, anti-neoliberal hat on if I don't get too careful. But I mean,
let me preface it a little bit more. Sorry to interrupt you. It's
yeah, go nuts.
I feel strongly about it, so I'm aware that there's a way that me or our conversation can come across as kind of arrogant or dismissive, to just speak to the psychological aspects of stuff. And that's not where I mean to come from with it. I don't like, it's not like I've never held an incorrect view before that wasn't grounded in fact or something, and then I needed to be like, oh, I was seeing that wrong, let me adjust it. And so I don't mean to come from that place of arrogance, but some things, I guess I would say some things are pretty knowable. And it causes me personally to feel distress and less trusting in people when there's such a widespread disregard for expertise.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, I think, speak to that a little bit. I mean, you and I are friends, so we're speaking like friends, and I am, I don't really rest on formality or anything like that. So I speak very, very openly, and I'm very open-hearted, and sometimes people find that warm, and sometimes people are like, okay, wow, all right. So, but it's same, like, I'm wrong all the time. Like, I'm terrified all the time. There's tons of stuff I don't know. Like, that's what having a PhD is like, I know a huge amount about a very tiny, unhelpful part of the universe with no transferable skills. So, you know, that's worth mentioning too. But yeah, I have found it incredibly frustrating, incredibly tiring, to try and do something by way of communicating science that I think is just common sense, people have a desire to know this stuff and to be met with just like rage, like, and it comes from fear, but real, like I had death threats from people that I know, which kind of blew me away. And my other half early on in it mentioned, he said something offhand about, I don't trust scientists. And it really, really cut me, because I think that people forget that scientists, nurses, doctors are human beings, they're fallible, they have families, they know people who have died from this, but they know a lot of shit about it, and it's worth listening to them. And this is why there are lots of different people with lots of different roles. Like, not everybody can be a scientist, not everybody can be a doctor, not everybody can be a fisherman in Alaska, right? So there's almost like there's this sort of social contract, like, I don't know about this stuff, but I trust this system, which is science or medicine or whatever. I trust it to keep me safe. And for some reason, that's not working. And I don't know if it's miscommunication, or if it's like the ivory tower of academia, or if it's capitalism or whatever, but it's just, there's a real kind of, there's a gap there, and it's really upsetting. But what can you do other than keep forging ahead, you know?
Yeah, respect. I hear you. Let's pivot in the time that we have to the more animist, relational, ritual, witchy, perhaps less conventional, at least in some circles, aspects of a global pandemic. And I wonder if you could start in a more general way by sharing a bit as a relational human being who's relating with ancestors in the land and all these other kinds of powers. Like, how do you personally think about, or what guides you in relationally perceiving, at least, what's going on with the SARS-CoV-2?
It's really easy to anthropomorphize anything that isn't human. And this is something that I've seen a lot with microbiology generally. You hear a lot about good microbes and bad microbes, right? And what that means is the good ones, like, we never have to worry about them, and then the bad ones are the ones that are out to get us, you know, they're coming for us kind of thing. And I think a lot of the rhetoric around this pandemic has followed that. So you hear a lot about the war against COVID, or the COVID fight, all this kind of thing. And what I really want to get across, and I try really hard to do, is this virus has proliferated and become successful pretty much entirely because of human action, right? This is a virus that has found itself in a situation, and it's just really good at being a virus. And that's all that microbes and viruses do. Like, they are motivated by a sole purpose, which is to replicate. It's not to give us food poisoning. It's not to kill my dad. It's not to do any of that. It's to replicate.
You're saying it's not the Earth trying to correct our exploitative ecological behavior either? But that's really pleasing reinforcement of my values, Shiv.
This is one of the first things that I spoke publicly about when this all started, was this, frankly, really kind of eco-fascist notion that this was some kind of a punishment or some kind of a reset, that humans don't deserve to be a part of this planet and blah, 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 blah. No, like, absolutely not. I don't subscribe to that at all. I think that human beings can be real dicks, for sure. And, you know, it's really hard to defend us sometimes, but, you know, I'm not going to have somebody say that my brother doesn't deserve to live. Like, he's a good dude, you know, he totally does. So that's a whole other aspect to it as well. But fundamentally, what has happened here with the pandemic is entirely predictable, entirely normal, and quite frankly, not a big surprise. And I think I would really like if people take one thing away, to move away from the idea that this is an evil being who's out to get us and Mother Nature has sent it to reset the balance of the world or something. Like,
You're trying to say it doesn't just harm unethical people or bad people?
That's Batman. That's not SARS-CoV-2. That's Batman.
There's some sort of bad connection. They, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
What are you trying to say, Shiv? Just revealed your big pharma connections. They,
yeah, no, I'm a shill for big virus.
It's great. They, I don't know if it's really funny, but yes. Tell me about
gallows humor in the business.
There are folks. Some people are, learning from me about relational etiquette and animism in the earth and all that wholesome stuff, and are wondering, and it's a really legit question, like, what's the etiquette here? Should we approach this one? Are there offerings to be made? Are there, what, like, ritually speaking? Let's assume this is from someone who's not like, I'm going to do ritual instead of wear a mask and wash my hands. And so there's like a, do the practical things. And then I got time left in the day. Ritually, how should I cover those bases? How do you think about that?
Yeah. It's really difficult because I think a lot of people are like, all right, what can I do? I need to do something. Like, how can I be useful? I understand that impulse. I have not dropped in with SARS-CoV-2 in the same way that I would not drop in with smallpox, way above my pay grade. And quite frankly, I don't want to stand in my kitchen waving a flag being like, hey, come on in. I guess the analogy is like seating your unwell ancestors at an altar. It's like, don't feed the ghosts, don't feed the viruses. So my, advice to anybody is, don't approach this one in particular. Don't drop in, because it's just so far away and it's so powerful. And furthermore, whatever is behind it that's driving it is also very powerful, in the same way that I would never suggest anybody like make spells against Donald Trump. It's like, Trump is a flea on the back of something much, much greater. And I really don't want to draw attention to myself in that way. And I think it's kind of outside of the scope of our understanding. That said, I guess a lot of people who watch this will have existing practices and existing relationships and allies, and maybe will be part of traditions that are quite likely to have deities or energies that relate to disease or pandemic. And almost certainly our ancestors have some kind of relationship with illnesses like these, whether it's tuberculosis or smallpox or something else. That, to me, and obviously, you disagree and instruct away, but that to me is the way to approach this, rather than posting up and being like, yoo-hoo, COVID, like, what's up, bro? What do you need? Kind of thing. I just think that's a bad way to approach it. And as with anything like this, and with any kind of practice that's focused on animism, it's about respect and understanding and common sense, I think.
Yeah, it's good. There's a lot in there. One of the things that strikes me in what you're saying is, in the same way that I wouldn't be like, oh, some people are getting sick, I understand what's happening. I would probably say, hey, do any of the doctors or microbiologists or virologists know what's going on? Because you have the skills that you've refined on how to look in that direction and make sense of what you're seeing. And I hear you saying that there are analogous powers that are more safe and tempered for living humans to relate with, that can provide useful context for folks seeking that in a way that is quite ritually different from saying, hey, SARS-CoV-2, I want to channel you through my crown chakra or something. And so,
Yeah, I think it's like, to me, it makes, like, would you cook a chicken and then like make an offering to salmonella before you served it? It just seems really arse about face to me. I just want to make sure this goes okay, bro. Here's some food, salmonella.
well, yeah, it's I follow what you're saying. I for one, I think that it's a bit like suddenly going to church when you're sick, in the sense that a lot of people don't have a prior existing relationship with the class of relatives or powers who are the microorganisms. And so, like, if you had a long-term existing relationship with several other kinds of viruses that may or may not harm humans, and then you ask them, you're like, whoa, this is one of your people that's having a big effect on some of the humans. Do you know this one? Or like, what's your take on that one? Like, so a lot of people don't have a prior relationship with that demographic of beings. And so there's a jumping ahead with the etiquette to just dive in there. That's one thing that strikes me. But the other is there are rituals of appeasement. And I think that rituals of saying, oh, this is a hazardous force. Is there a way to give an acknowledgement and say, may you have this instead of me, kind of thing? Now, microbiologically, the virus is probably like, I'd really much rather have you. You're a big, warm, cozy, replicating host thing. And so I think that it'd be like, no, thanks. But if the offering, I think the intent of having an offering of appeasement is one that does have precedence in tradition, but even so, it's usually directed to the powers that oversee
Right.
disease, who are not the diseases themselves necessarily.
Right. So like I've got an offering to our guy out front of my house, but it's not an offering to the virus, it's an offering to Baba. It's
Indeed.
and
Yeah.
that's the whole have this instead of my house kind of thing.
Yeah.
With respect.
And
So yeah, I think that's the difference.
yeah, and which is an important one for safety. And so in that sense, folks who are following what I'm teaching, it would make sense to go to your wise and kind ancestors or other powers that you already know and trust and ask them, is there anything that is appropriate for me to know and helpful for me to know for my own path, with the understanding that some things are above our pay grade, so to speak. And that what you spoke to earlier is sometimes you may wish to get information about a thing. And it's one thing to sit right where you're at and just turn your eyes to the left and be curious about what's already happening over there. It's another thing to walk over there and be like, what you doing?
Yeah.
And so there are different ways of gathering information. One is just observing from right where you're at. And just that can still draw attention. The one, depending on the complexity of the one being observed, it may know that you are observing it. And
yeah. I think it's worth remembering as well at the moment that it's like everybody's paying attention to this one at the moment. Like
right.
There's a huge amount of focus on this thing, and it's how does that affect the dynamic? Because at any given moment you could turn your attention to bear, but the whole world isn't turning their attention to bear at that time as well, and that's what's different here too. And also, when you throw in the fact that people around you may be infected, or people who have died, and it's just it's like there's a lot of white noise, and I don't personally feel confident like pulling at that thread.
Understandable. There's another circumstance where, to me at least, it would feel different, which is if you know that you're infected. And so if this one has crossed the line basically to enter your cells and use them to replicate. Like at that point, like if somebody's inside my house, I would welcome knowledge about what they're doing in so far as it could help me to address the situation. And so, I mean, potentially, I don't want to interview them necessarily, but does it feel different than what you had just outlined if someone has become infected, to be curious?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I live in a slightly rough area of Albuquerque, and I sleep next to an axe and a can of bear spray. So if somebody came into my house, my first instinct would be like, "What's up? Here's my bear spray. Like, how are we going to deal with this?" So it's totally different. I think the best way to approach this, from my understanding and work with the microorganisms and smalls, is to remember that there's a huge percentage of your corporeal form that's already microbial. You already have a really comprehensive, ancient cohort of bacteria, fungi, viruses that have associated with you since you were born, like since before you were born, through your mother and your father and your environment. And I think the best way to approach any type of direct observation of SARS-CoV-2 within your own body is to go through them, right? And to drop in with them first and be like, "Whoo, so this sucks. What do you think about it?" kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard because the instinct when you feel like you're invaded, and this is the same instinct that I've sort of worked through with folks who have Lyme disease or another kind of chronic infection or relationship that wasn't invited. Your first instinct is to be like, "Dude, like, what the hell?" Like, but yeah, I mean, you know, it's a thing that's happened. It is what it is. And just try and remember that this is not an act of malice or malevolence. This is a being just being really good at being itself. It's the same thing as me coming home and there's a skunk by my front door. Like, he's just skunking. And, you know, I react appropriately. It's the same sort of deal. It's really, really difficult. And it's especially not helpful for somebody who isn't infected with COVID, hasn't been infected with COVID, but this is my sense of it.
Yeah, good. I made a comment in the spring when I've tried really just once to listen in, and I just went to my ancestors. I'm like, okay, I don't want to look at it, I don't want to see it, but is there anything you want me to know? Like, give me a little bit of context. What's going on here? And one of the things I said, which was disconcerting to me, it still kind of is that the virus is the arrow, not the archer, or an arrow. And, you know, they're giving the image. I'm not saying it's concrete truth or good medicine as a frame for everybody, but somebody asks a question based on that. You know, anything else to say about that? And then goes on to ask, well, if you're going to set it up like that, Daniel, who's the archer? And so I'm like, so
what a question.
Let me try. I'm like, don't ask that. Don't say that out loud. All right. So let me try to engage a little bit since I put it out there. I don't know, for one. In Yoruba traditions, one of the powerful elder deities, Obaluaye, Ibababao, is sometimes spoken of as fighting with or wielding the power of infectious disease, which is a nuance of distinction that one is not necessarily the disease itself. And so I do not recommend just approaching that deity, but it is an example of a traditional framework that suggests that there are the diseases and then a more senior complex kind of deity that is doling out or enacting, you know, those forces in the universe. I feel really strongly that there are powers, forces that are above our, I use a language of above our pay grade, but that are above our current capacity to safely engage with or to see accurately. And I definitely feel that myself. And so I haven't poked at this situation because it feels above my pay grade. And I'm not totally new to ritual. And I'm like, I don't want to know really. I mean, if I need to know, they'll tell me as much as I need to know, but I don't want to push at it, right? And so that's one thing that feels true for me, and that we're in a very multidimensional kind of existence here on Earth. The complexity of humans, in particular, not only but also us, draws in all kinds of things, and there's some way in which the current pandemic and my instinct of it has like shifted the balance point or something. Like there's a way in which the overall, I don't know, not to be so woo about it, but like the energy body, the quality of, the thing happening on Earth right now, it's like it just moved an inch to the left or something. And that shift, or that like sense that there are things, other dimensional things that are present on the Earth that weren't present in quite the same way a year ago. That something feels true to me about that, but I'm not fishing for details. Mostly I'm like, what do I need to be doing personally to stay alive, to be respectful, to stay on track? So I don't push for more information than I have access to. That's what I would say. I'm open, if anything there, Shiv, triggers anything you'd want to add as well.
No, I think like you and I are fairly aligned in this opinion. I think, from a visceral perspective, I am frightened of this virus in the same way that I'm frightened of lots of other diseases. And I'm also frightened of, coming across a hungry mountain lion when I'm hiking. It's, yeah, it's a difficult thing, but I think there's a lot going on at the moment, but there is also a really kind of subtle thing that you can start to observe and pull apart when you look at the human dynamics of a pandemic. And we're not quite there yet with this one, but you can see it in things like the last big Ebola outbreak in Western Africa. That outbreak was not contained and solved by Western science, right? That disease is really brutal in the sense that it makes use of the ways that we are human. Like Ebola is passed from person to person by close contact. So it's passed between people who are sick and dying and the person who is taking care of them, or through burials and things like that. And the way that disease was stopped was by people not doing that, like not looking after their dead and not taking care of their sick and kind of giving them up to this idea that they understood the way the virus was being passed through. They had to trust people who weren't necessarily trustworthy based on their past actions, Western scientists, things like that. But they did it, and that's how they stopped the pandemic. And that's, there are aspects of that are really heartbreaking, but also worth studying to learn from. And there's a lot going on at the moment that we can't see, that we're only going to be able to see when we're out the other end of it. And again, that just kind of speaks to me. It kind of reaffirms the notion that this virus is not it, it's not what it's all about.
Say what you mean by that very last part. a little more if you can. I
I
don't want to
think
assume.
I think your analogy is good, the archer and the arrow, but also the notion that this might be, this pandemic is kind of a tool. It's an opportunity for people to interact with the situation in a way that's of a much more broader understanding than this is an infectious disease and it's coming to kill us all. Because there's so much more happening than this is a virus and we're all going to die, right? This virus is not, it's not out to get us. It doesn't crawl along the floor trying to find its next victim kind of thing. It's not a serial killer. And look at everything that's come about as a result of this pandemic, the politics, the social stuff. I mean, it's particularly pronounced in the US, but back in the UK, where I'm from, Sweden, New Zealand, like look at all the myriad kind of really diverse ways that people have responded to it and the way that they interact with other people as a result of it. And then, you know, if we can take a really big step away from it and look at it from 40,000 feet, once this is over, there's another pandemic on the way, 100% guaranteed. And that will come about as a result of deforestation or climate change or something else that's largely anthropogenic in nature. So what have we learned? How do we address that? How do we use these lessons to address climate change or poverty? Or, you know, there's just a really rich tapestry that's being built from all of this. And it's not just about this one tiny particle, this one tiny infectious agent. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. That even though we can honor the science really closely, it's not the job of the microbiologist per se to weave the larger human and societal and planetary meaning, all of it, you know, and all the choices that go into that. So, yeah, absolutely, it makes sense.
I think this is community work in the same way that ancestral medicine is community work, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Good, I agree. I want to make folks aware of your offerings in the world. I know at microanimism.com, they can find out about the mentoring that you offer, whether it's people who want to know more about microbiology, lay people, official students, or other scientists who want to bring in a more relational animist perspective to what they're doing, and want a colleague who speaks the language, and that you're available for talks, and that you know what you're talking about, and that you also are developing in your other work ways of honoring the microorganisms and vectors of interference to growing things we like to grow in ways that can remove pesticides from the equation. And so for people who want to understand the other kinds of research and development work that you are under, you know, that you're immersed in, that they could find out about that as well. So anything else you want to add about your offerings in the world, Siv, if people want to connect with you?
I don't think so. I have social media on Instagram and Facebook, which is also microanimism. I don't understand it and I'm really bad at it, but that's a good way to follow what I'm up to. But if anybody wants to get in touch, then the website is the best way to do it. And I'm always open to hearing from people who are interested.
And you're very serious and cautious and diplomatic in your expression all the time, right?
Yes.
Good. That'll be important. So,
very British about it.
Thanks for your time and everything you're doing, and for your service with the larger undertaking that is careful observation and understanding of the smalls.
Yep.
Good.
Thanks for inviting me to do this again. It's always a good time.
Good. Thanks, Shiv. Take care.